Now, has anybody heard from Yuki Watanabe? Anybody?
Yuki?
Yeah. Watanabe-san?
I don't know.
Ikushima-san usually comes a little bit late. I suspect he's coming from somewhere else. When somebody comes always late at the same time, you come to the conclusion that there's something else that's keeping them from getting here on time. So we're going to talk today about climate change. To finish up, and actually what we're going to talk about is something, the data that I sent to you, Nazmi. The
Useful.
yeah, that's and I wanted to update that, but the I think I got the link to that site. It's a very good site. It's a site that does a lot of data on climate change and on energy use. I think I have the link here. If not, I'll make that clear. But I checked it. They haven't updated it since last year when I made those slides. That was data for 2014, and they haven't updated that. I think there's more recent data available. There's more recent data available, I think, from the International Energy Administration of the U.S. Or is that the U.S.? But there's the International Energy Administration that puts out data. So there's other data, but that's a great place to get started. And I like the way they laid it out. You've seen the data, and I'm going to talk about that today. And there's something very interesting that has come up. I was reading about the Bitcoin, the Bitcoin thing. Bitcoin, of course, is going crazy, and I personally think that there's these markets are. I think there's some little people are going to lose a lot of money. One of the things I was thinking about was that if you are let's say you're a merchant, and somebody comes and pays you with Bitcoin now, I would be very reluctant to take. I would expect that Bitcoin, if you give me something if I sell you something that's $1,000, and you give me what's valued at $1,000 in Bitcoin now, I wouldn't. I'm taking risk. I'm taking currency risk. So, and I can't hedge it. I can't hedge that. But the point about the interesting point of Bitcoin is that in terms of this class and in terms of the subject, is that Bitcoin, the people are using massive amounts of computer time to try to mine new Bitcoins. And you can mine. You have to solve an algorithm in order to make a new Bitcoin, and there's a lot of computation. It's very computationally intense, and it sounds like many of the computers that are doing this, but it's thought that about 50% of the computers doing this are located in China, and they're basically burning up an enormous amount of energy. The amount of energy that the computers are burning to try to make new Bitcoins and process Bitcoin transactions is enormous. I think it was saying, was it greater than the electricity used by Ireland? I think it's greater than the electricity. That was the statement that I saw, was that the people they're burning up more electricity, using more electricity to try to make more Bitcoins than all of the electricity used in the country of Ireland. And we're talking about something that ultimately is not worth burning up that much energy. So that's it. This kind of brings up something that computerization and the advancement of computerization is actually going to increase demand for energy. And I think that people aren't really ready for it. And certainly, that's one of the things that I think is important to think about when we think about people talking about renewable energy and electricity. Anyway, let's get started. And I started the last time, and you can see that this is greenhouse gas output by world region. And this was between 2000 and 2010. That was the data that was on the site, but that I can make that comparison by region was 2010. I'm going to check that and see if I can update that. But at any rate, this is you can see over that, and things are probably have increased maybe a little bit slower at a slower rate in this decade, but I would think we're probably over 40,000 metric ton CO2 output equivalent annually globally. But you can see here, as we talked about, the Asian Oceania, the big gain. Most of the rest of the world was fairly flat, except that the Middle East had saw a major increase. Africa, some, and some in Central America, very flat in the former USSR. Europe and the US actually, Europe and North America, US, Canada actually experienced declines in the amount of greenhouse gas output. Now, the important thing to remember here is that Europe and North America were hard hit. In 2010, were very hard hit by the global downturn. So that had played certainly some role in that. And as I mentioned, if you take the direct effect, and what we talked about in class about the direct effect of CO2, that a doubling would produce a 1 degree Celsius rise, the massive increase in East Asia that we've observed between 2000 and 2010 would have, the direct effect was about a 0.04 Celsius degree increase in global temperatures. North America, 0.0. Let's see what that is. Oh, I think that had to do with some other factors as well in North America. Any rate, now what we're going to do, we're going to break it down, and as I mentioned, certainly electricity is the most important use of in terms of generating greenhouse gases total. And we talked about, and I wanted to focus on electricity and to talk about you've learned, and we've talked about the importance of electricity. That there's no way that you can that you can underestimate. Electricity is the essential reason why humans have been able to improve our living standards over the dramatic way that we have over the past 170, 200 years, but really the past 170 years. It really gets back to the use of harnessing the use of electricity, first with electronic telecommunications, then with the development of electricity in the with the electric motor in the late 19th century, the use of electricity in houses, computers are entirely, it's electronic, it's the use of electricity. All of that is electricity based, and in fact, as I say, when I talked about the Bitcoin example and all the electricity is being used just to mine Bitcoins, the use of computer use is going to probably dramatically increase, and we'll want to keep that in mind. So that is the biggest single use of CO2 is the use of electricity. So you're going to have to figure out. So we really want to take a look and see how electricity is generated. That's what we're going to focus on here. Obviously, there are other parts. Agriculture, this is primarily through methane gas. That's when you raise animals, they make a lot of methane. The use of methane, that's primarily methane. This is from the burning of fossil fuels, petrol, for transport, industrial construction, mining, manufacturing. There's all kinds of different things. Actually, things like the making of cement actually produces a lot of CO2. The manufacture of cement. So if you're going to build buildings, you have cement. That has a large impact. The residential is actually pretty small, only 7.2%. The other fuel combustion, not so important. I'm not sure what that is. I wonder if that's like the burning of wood and things like that. And as I said, on the margin, this is what you want to look at, because this tells you where the expansion is taking place. And electricity in that 2000-2010 period contributed almost 50% of the observed increase. It was used in order to produce electricity. Industrial construction manufacturing, also a high percentage, 27.7%. I think the other fuel consumption was also above. You see, the transport was lower. Transport is not the problem. Transport's not the problem. Agriculture is ultimately. These are not the major problem. What we're really concerned about, the most important thing, is the production of electricity. That's what when we're thinking about this. That's what we have to be most. We want to focus the most on. And now what we're going to do is go and look at global electricity generation by and both for the 2000 and 2014. Yeah, 2014, because that's the last date, the last year that data is available. As I say, they haven't updated it. It'd be nice if they would. It's a nice work that they've done. But as I mentioned, and I did introduce this in the last class, 38%, the biggest amount is produced by coal. Coal's the biggest the biggest way that electricity is produced in the world. Now, coal uses, it's not that much, people talk about it as being a dirty, and we're talking about on the margin. It's thought to be, I think, about somewhere roughly around 20% more CO2 output when you use coal as compared to natural gas. So it has a factor, but it's not really a major factor. It's probably more as the pollutants. It produces a lot. Coal produces more pollutants than natural gas. Some could argue that if you're putting a lot of particulates in the air, that might actually have a cooling effect. I'm not sure about that. So gas and hydro about the same, a little bit more than 1/6. Nuclear right at 1/6. Oil is actually very little. You don't use much. Petroleum is actually very little used to generate electricity. It's not, and it's kind of a shrinking. Not much electricity is produced by oil-powered electric plants. So that was the total global electric output, 14,720 terawatts of energy that was produced in the year 2000. So now we're going to look and see how did that change in that period, and you see how coal increased. So we're talking about all of this, the problems with coal. People are worried about coal, but the use of coal actually increased between 2000 and 2014. And as we'll see, it was really driven by China. And in fact, when you look at the situation with India, I think we're going to be very much the same. Now, certainly gas played a role as well. There's a big increase in gas. Hydro stayed about the same. Gas increased. Coal, that's 60% of total output. You can see oil shrunk. So oil is kind of disappearing. Renewables became 6.7%. And you can see the difference between 2000 and 2014. Wind was 0.2, and it grew to 3.1%. So that was the big increase. Solar, it doesn't even register. It's basically 0 in 2000, but it's still less than 1%. Less than 1% of global output of global production of electricity is solar, and a lot of money's been spent on solar. A lot of money. Solar is not a cheap way to produce electricity at all. There's a good reason why it's not. There's a lot of problems associated with solar. Perhaps then they could be solved. You have to use a lot of land. In a country like Japan, it's hard to get available land that's near where you can actually connect it to the grid. That's the problem you have in Japan, is that there's agricultural land, but you have to use it to, this country doesn't produce enough food anyway, so it's either, are you going to give up food production to make electricity in good locations? But the problem with solar is it's called intermittent power, and it's relatively unpredictable. It depends on how much sun is shining, and it can cause surges. If it gets sunny, you can cause a surge in electric production. And that surge, you have to monitor that, and sometimes my understanding is that can be difficult. That can put too much electricity into a system. Basically, electricity is produced to be immediately consumed. It's produced, it goes on the line, it's fed in, the users, there's so much use that the electricity is produced in that way. The only way you can store electricity is with batteries. Batteries are, and people are trying to develop, there's a lot of improvements that are happening, and some people are real excited about that, and that may be the use of, there has been some rapid improvement in batteries, and I'll perhaps talk a little bit more about that later. Biomass, a very small percentage, as I say, it's kind of, it's kind of the use of, I'm not sure that that's really it's sustainable in the terms that you're reusing something, but you have to use a lot of land for biomass. It requires a lot of land. You have to give up food production to produce it. There's the real pluses and minuses with biomass. Geothermal is just not very important, and geothermal is this country has a bit of geothermal, but it's not an important part of electric output. As I say, we had 52.4% increase in electric production in the 2000-2014 period. Now what I've done here is I've done this on a log, electricity generation by energy source rural regions. In world regions, mostly this is remember, this is log, so it's not linear. It's a log. It's log linear. You can see that this is a big increase. That's a huge. You can see the countries that are really on upward trajectory in terms of electricity production. That really stands out. I think China probably is leveled out, but unless they keep on producing all the computers to produce all those bitcoins. We'll see what happens with that. But China should be kind of leveling. It should start leveling out. But India is going to be growing. India is going to start having a trajectory right here. In fact, you can see that India by 2014 almost reached where China was in 2000, and China. You can see China just a little bit more than Japan, and then a big increase. That was a huge increase, and I think we are going to see something like that over the next, maybe not 15 years, maybe 20 years, 25 years in India. India is definitely rapidly developing. Now I'm going to break it down by regions and areas of the world. Europe in 2000 had coal and nuclear are about the same, just right, 28, 29, 30%. Hydro, a little bit more than the world average, not much. Less than the world average for coal, more for nuclear. We'll see. There's one country in particular that has that. And gas, a fair bit of gas, not much. The renewables are small, but not zero. And oil, not so important. And we'll see we're going to see a couple of big increases. The renewables, look at the size of renewables, the change in renewables, how coal declined by 5 percentage points, 29.8, 5.5 percentage points. Renewables explode. The renewables exploded in Europe during that period. We could see gas was about the same. Nuclear shrank. But renewables, a huge burst of of the use of renewables. Wind, the most important, 8%. You've got countries like Denmark that have a lot of wind. Denmark is a peninsula that's called Jutland, and Jut is an English word that means to stick out. Denmark sticks out into the North Sea, and they have a lot of wind. Germany has a bit of wind as well. Countries that can use that certainly made use of that. But I think it's important to remember it's not a cheap form of power. And in fact, the fact is that I would argue that one of the reasons, when you look at this use of electricity, this increase of using expensive, was an expensive form. They increased their output of renewables, and they gave up cheaper coal in order to produce more expensive renewables. And that's at a time that when you're competing, the problem with that is for manufacturing. Manufacturing can be very sensitive to energy prices. And so you're talking about a lot of middle-class jobs, middle-class, working-class jobs in these countries that have been at risk. And one of these days, somebody's going to have to look and see that Europe has performed very poorly economically in this century. It's 2014, very, very slow economic growth. Much slower even than the United States. And I think at least some contribution was the fact that they increased their energy prices. That does not help an economy grow. So they did that at the expense. And in fact, we've seen some political reaction. I think part of the political reaction is slow economic growth, among other problems. But I think that that surge of renewables has not necessarily helped in Europe. United States, interestingly, 2000, coal was more than 50% of electric output. And again, much of that output is concentrated in the northeastern part of the United States. States like Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, those states that, again, this is an issue in terms of the cost of electricity. The U.S. about 20% nuclear in 2000, gas about 15, and you'll see the renewables grew, big decline in coal, big increase in gas. The gas, of course, had to do with the fracking revolution in the United States. Hydraulic fracking, fracturing, you reach down into rock, and then you go vertical and then horizontal in rock. The technique involves shooting water at high pressure in order to break up gas and oil-bearing rocks, and to bring the gas and rock out and then pump it up to the surface. That's the technique that has been perfected in the last 15, 20 years in the United States. So it had a big impact on increasing the use of gas in the United States, a decline in the use of coal. The nuclear has actually grown, which is interesting. But that's probably going to go down in the future. There are new nuclear power plants are being constructed. Renewables increasing. Wind was a big increase. And you have states like in the Midwestern part of the United States, like Texas, that are on plains, that have a lot of wind and no people. They were able to put up a lot of windmills. And in certain places in California has done a fair bit of that. I think states like Iowa as well. So you've had quite a bit of wind, but again, it's not a cheap. You're talking about a subsidized form of power that's had to be subsidized. Hydro is interesting because you see the U.S. has a small amount of hydro and shrinking. And one of the problems is that a lot of people, hydro is a renewable energy source. See how I say other renewables? Hydro is renewable. But the problem with hydro is that it can create environmental problems. So, of course, all of these can create environmental problems too. But hydros, you have to flood a lot of area, dams silt up. It can affect fish. There's some negative environmental impacts, and so there's been a lot of opposition to hydro. So when we talk about other renewables, we're really just, what you really would want to focus on is solar and wind, and there, even now, in 2014 in the US, 4.7%. And solar, again, solar is only 0.4%, just not a big source of power, folks. You know, you may be reading about it. There's probably more energy spent to tell people about solar than the amount of solar, the energy that's actually produced by solar, you know, to make the electricity to tell people about. But this is the big, now we're really going to talk about the big impact of where we're going to see the growth, where we've seen the growth in the use of coal. Here in India in 2000, they only had 535 terawatts of output, which is probably, I think when we get to France, I think it's roughly the output of France, but you have to remember that India has a population 20 times. It's almost 20 times the population of France. That's how many people live in India. That's about 20 times. So you're thinking 20 times with about the same electricity production in 2000. That's telling you that it's a lot lower income, a lot lower living standard, and 68% was produced by coal. Now what we're going to see, and the only other major is hydro. Hydro is just up in the north. You've got in the mountain, the Himalayas, and the foothills of the Himalayas in the northern part of the country, that you have that you can have some hydro. You're not much of the country. You don't have the capability of producing electricity by hydro. But there, because there is a lot of population in the north as well. Nuclear very low, oil of course low, and gas not very high. Your renewables is primarily geothermal, which is just kind of there. Geothermal, as we'll see, although people talk about geothermal a lot, usually if you see a lot of geothermal, the country's pretty poor. Geothermal is just not a significant form. You can see what happened is that you doubled the electricity output. See the 1,117 terawatts, 535, that's more than double. You more than double the output, and the coal percentage went up to 71.6%. So 68 to 70, so an increase of 3.6 percentage points, which means that probably about, you do the math, about 75% of the increased capacity was in coal. They're building they built coal-fired power plants in order to increase their output of electricity, and I assure you that's what they're going to do. They're going to do it. And an interesting thing is, I've been following this in Australia. There's been a controversy about a big coal mine that in the state of Queensland that coal is destined for the Indian market. An Indian company is trying to build the mine. For the time being, I think it's been stopped. It's been stopped. And again, it's one of these conflicts between urban upper middle class people that are different from these people that need this kind of power in order to develop. So that's part of the issue here. Now we're going to see. You see that here's China. Now China 77. This was in 2000, 77.6. Now here's the important number. Look at this number. That's 1,280. You'll know. Remember what I said. That's just a little bit more than India in 2014. See, oops. Okay, sorry. There's India 2014. There's China. So just a little bit more. More than 75%. 3/4 was done with coal. A fair bit of hydro. China has hydro capacity. It does have a lot of mountains in the west and southwestern parts of the country. But you'll see the nuclear very low, other renewables almost zero. They're just burning up, probably that's just burning wood to 0.2%. Now look at the change, 71.5%. That looks good. That looks like China China used less coal, but look at the output. Look at the output there, 1280 to 5145. It's a 4-time increase. They increased 4 times. So more than about 65% or so of the increase in electric output was done through coal-fired electric power plants. So enormous, that means they required an enormous amount of coal. And now China is the single largest producer of electricity in the world. And as I mentioned earlier about the Bitcoin mining, they got the coal and they're using the Bitcoin mining to, at any rate. You've got the renewables. They have done a lot of wind. That's quite a bit of wind on the margin. That's 2.9%, but 4 times. That would be about 10% of the electric output in 2000 is wind. So that 2.9% represents quite a large amount of wind. Solar, very low. There's talk about increasing solar output. As you know, China wants to, they want to build electric cars. They want to get very much into the electric car industry. They're very much involved in that. But I think part of that is the strategy, is an export strategy. It's an export strategy. You can see nuclear 2.5. I think that's going to increase. There's every indication that China is going to have a big increase in the changes in their production capacity in the future are going to come from an increase in nuclear power. And of course, China in doing that is much less concerned than countries like Japan about what happens to its people. They are going to, which also tells you that's going to happen. They're going to make it. They're going to make it happen. You're going to have that increase. Coal is going to shrink. It's going to shrink a bit, but it's still going to be an important part of electricity production. Here's Germany. Now we look at the European countries. Germany, 542. That was in 2000. About the same, in fact, almost exactly the same as India in 2000, but with about 15 times, 1/15 the population. Germany is about 80 million, population about 80 million, India about 1.2 billion, so yeah, about 15 times. So that 30% produced by nuclear. Now the interesting thing here is that Prime Minister Merkel declared after the earthquake in 2011 here in Japan and the problems that caused at the Fukushima nuclear power plant on the coast, that they were going to get rid of all of their nuclear in 10 years. So they're now, 4 years away, supposedly, from shutting down all their nuclear. That was 30% of their electric output. That's quite interesting. But coal, more than 50%. Now you'll see the change. The renewables, Germany's gone crazy with renewables. Absolutely crazy. You're talking about solar, 6%. I've never been to Germany, but I've been to the German part of Switzerland. And if it's anything like one of the things that I was traveling from Italy to northern Switzerland, and it was sunny in Italy. It was the summer, got on the train, went in the tunnel, got on the other side, and it was that gray sky. Germany's a cloudy country. It's really cloudy. It's cloudy and cold country. They got 6%. That means they're spending a lot of effort for solar. And the wind is, I think, probably North Sea. Most of that's going to be the North Sea off the coast. So they've done a lot of effort for renewables. The big reduction in nuclear. You can see almost very little increase in output. Just a little bit of an increase. 572 was at 542. So just about a 6% increase in 14 years, a very small increase. that reflects the small increase in economic growth. The problem with this is that for a lot of manufacturing, that comes at the cost of making electricity more expensive. And this is going to be an issue for manufacturers if German industry competes because it's very productive. Germans are very, very good at technical design, and so they're able to. They've been able so far to reasonably compete, but it'll be interesting to see if that continues to be the case. It's also important to note. See, the gas has a small percentage. It's 10%. That's gas from Russia. One of the things that the Europeans won't do fracking, hydraulic fracking. The environmentalists are very strong in Europe, and that's something they won't do. That's the situation there. Now we're looking at France. France is fascinating because look at that nuclear. That's 77% in 2000. France is a fascinating difference. They built a lot of nuclear plants, and they've had a lot of nuclear power. And you can see 2000. Only 9% of electricity was generated by fossil fuels in France. And remember, France is a nuclear power. They have the nuclear. They have the atom bomb. They have the bomb. So they're one of the countries that had that. That certainly was part of the development of that. But you look, they do have mountains, so they have a bit of hydro, but hardly any coal, oil, gas. Biomass a little bit, almost no solar. That was 2000. Now we'll see, you've had the renewables have increased, but not like in Germany, and nuclear has basically almost stayed the same. And you'll see the output has increased. Nuclear is pretty much the same percentage. There's an increase in wind and solar, but nothing like in Germany. And the reason is nuclear is already a bit more. It's a more expensive form of power anyway. So the French are not going to be doing this. It's in terms of emissions of CO2, zero. You have zero emissions of CO2 emissions in nuclear. So there's much less of a push for renewable power in France compared to Germany. Now we're going to see. And my favorite country, of course, Italy. I have close ties to that country, but it's also because there's so many things that are comical about Italy. And one of them, well, you'll see the Italians made 32% came from oil. Nobody uses oil. The Italians it's almost as big as gas. They're using a lot of, I believe it's Russian gas, and lots of oil, a little bit of coal, and you'll notice the nuclear. Do you see that? You see that figure? Zero. Okay. Now the reason why is that the Italians voted in I think it was the late 1980s, to ban nuclear power plants. They were not going to allow nuclear power plants. But you also look at the electricity output. Italy is about the same population as France. Okay, let's go back to the French production. There's 252, go to France. Yeah, 512, double. So how can France produce double the power of Italy? I assure you, Italians aren't saving on power. I've been to Italy many times, and they use as much power as anybody else in Europe. You have to buy it. And these are people that passed a law to ban nuclear power. So where do you think they buy their power from? They buy it from the French. They buy it from nuclear power plants. And the French have nuclear power plants that are right on the Italian border. Literally, they have nuclear power plants that are right on the border in order to sell nuclear power to the Italians. Electricity, that generate electricity, the Italians buy. So go figure that. Any rate, that is, and you can see though, look at the big change, because Italy had to make a big, and they changed it with gas. Again, a big increase in renewables. That's all really wonderful. Do you know what the economic growth rate in Italy in between 2000 and 2014? You know what it was? Zero. Zero, absolute zero. The economy did not grow. It was one of the lowest growing economies in the world. They're crazy on renewables. They already don't have high. They have relatively high electric costs. They buy a lot of nuclear power from France. It's not a formula for the average person to thrive in. So that's part of the problem here, is that we're seeing these countries that are getting very, very aggressive, and it's wonderful. They're trying to reduce their CO2 outputs, but it's coming at a cost, and the cost is in many cases, just at least to some degree, is the average person. The average person is paying. They have to pay higher electric costs. People that are on the margin are going into what's called electric poverty, and we're seeing that. You've seen that in the United Kingdom a lot. United Kingdom is another country that's gotten very, very aggressive about renewable power. You can see 2000, and again, the 353. It's bigger than Italy, but it's smaller than France, and certainly smaller than France. And I think Germany, the UK probably had to buy some power from France as well. And you can see, there we go. See, they're producing less output. The less output, big increase in renewable, a big increase in renewable. And again, a lot of that is wind. They had a huge amount of wind. See, gas has declined. Coal stayed about the same. Gas declined. But renewables increased quite dramatically. And again, the average person is paying higher for energy. The average person is poor, so that's part of the problem here. I mean, hopefully future generations. I hope future generations are saved for all this, because there's a lot of people that are suffering now from all of this. But this is the you can see there the wind 7.7%. A lot of use of wind there. So here's here I calculated the impact of the change in greenhouse gas output 2000-2010. I wanted to show you how much of an impact of the if we assumed a constant, the level of output stayed constant at 2000 in 2000. The level constant in 2000. But if you just took the increase from the increase in output in greenhouse gas output, what's the impact? Well, when you measure on the margin the increase, most of that, it's 1/100th a degree, and that's primarily in China. Former Soviet Union about 0.007 degrees, and everything else, you got a little bit of negatives. The whole direct effect, that says, it should be a little bit more than 0.13. Well, Europe and North America. It's about, it would be 0.13, 0.15. But the point is, that's 1/100th of a degree. In other words, the increase, the direct increase, as a result of the increase in CO2 emissions, increased the global, in the 14 years, had on the margin increase in global temperatures of 0.01 degrees. If you had not had that, if that increase had not taken place, now that doesn't mean you would have had an increase from just the continued use. Okay, so you're just, if you kept it 2000 levels, you're still increasing the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. You're still increasing the amount of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. But on the margin, the marginal increase of the marginal increase was only 0.1 degrees. So it's not, The effort, my point here is that the effort here by North America and Europe to reduce, all of this has come at a certain amount of economic pain, certainly for North America and Europe. And I think to some degree has led to the election of Donald Trump. Donald Trump's president of the United States in part because of what those people have experienced. So now nobody can ignore that. But you're talking about at almost no impact, no marginal impact in terms of reducing, the effort to reduce has had almost no marginal impact on output, on the output of, on the change of the global temperature. Now to say 0.13 degrees, your volatility, your standard deviation of temperatures annual is 0.1 degree. So it's about 7, the increase is 1/7 the standard deviation of the increase on the margin. In other words, all of this impact nobody can tell. Nobody can tell you cannot get out and measure. It's almost, you almost cannot measure the effect of it. And yet it's causing a lot of economic problems. So that's something to keep in mind. I must have, let me check, because I know I've got some other slides for you. I think I did this for Japan, and a few other countries. I think I did it for Japan. Let me look, because I know I have some other stuff here. And that particular, this is, here, this right here, that's it. Go to that site. It's a great site. Great site. That'll have, that should have, for what you want to do, that should have, that's a great place to get started. And you can easily spend the whole, as an undergraduate using that as your main source. I think it's a really fine site. The presentation is very good. It's a little bit hard to use. It's not the easiest to use, but you'll get used to it. That's just part of learning how to use a site. But as I say, all of the tables that here I made from the data on that site. I also wanted to let's see. I have to put in the source, the book. I'll have to add that. This is where I get the temperature records, the time series. This is for the last 2,000 years. If you're interested in the annual amount of CO2 in the atmosphere in the last 2,000 years, that's there. This is the monthly time series from Mauna Loa that's been measuring actually since the late 1950s, and I use that from 1974. This is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That is, I think everybody knows, is familiar with the IPCC. These are two sources that mainstream climatology, that there's a more aggressive belief that on the amount of positive feedbacks, and what I call and what people call lukewarm. These are people, and like myself, that that certainly accept that there's a problem with CO2, that it is causing the climate to warm. It is a potential problem, but we're still not sure whether it is a major problem. And that is, these are people that argue that it could be a small. The evidence is not clear, and in fact, it could easily be a relatively small positive feedback. As I say, that's a great site. You'll really enjoy. I think you'll get a lot out of that site. Now I'm going to talk the work that I did. I wanted to update. This is in 2015. I was starting to update this, and it was just too much. And this is I use the corruption index. Just check the time here. The corruption. The corruption index talks about what's the the measurement of, and I've got it, you've been, Hanako, you've been using this, you've started using this site. So this is it's a very interesting site. It's an organization based in London, Transparency International. They're interested in taking at least measurements of corruption. And I think that there's at least a reasonable, this is just a sample. This is some of the sample of some of the data that I use, and it gives you kind of a feel for how much availability it is. Oh, your country is there, isn't it? Yes, that's right, Brunei, and it says 60. And that's, 60 means relatively, that's relatively low actually. That's a relatively, that if it's more than 50, now you'll see like the Western countries get rated quite high, in other words, a low corruption, by the standards of any African country. Any African country, that 60 is higher, and in fact it's higher than Italy. So Brunei is considered. The Transparency International thinks that Brunei is much less corrupt than Italy, and they're probably right. So, and Greece, and Greece, I might add. But that's part of the problem, is that countries that there is, we can observe some relation. We want to talk about the relationship between government, governance, the people's freedom and ability, and personal and political freedom and economic development. And there's certainly, one can argue that there's some impact. There's certainly there's certainly clear signs of that. I've done business personally with, I did a transaction for the Nigerian embassy. I actually, if you know, it's behind, it's in Toranamon, and I actually brokered the sale of that, the purchase of that building for the Nigerian government. And when I did that transaction, it was a rather curious one, because I was actually working with Israelis. There's an Israeli company that was representing the Nigerian government, because nobody was going to deal with the Nigerians directly. Nobody could trust the Nigerians. So, and the thing was that in working with them, you really got the sense of that there was zero, you couldn't trust anything. Nothing. They had a reputation here for not paying their bill. They rented. They had embassy staff had rented apartments and they didn't pay. But when I met these people, there was no trust. They really, they lived in an environment where nobody trusted anybody. They absolutely had no trust. And so that was real. And certainly have seen that kind of thing. When you do go to countries that are less developed, that there is something, there is less trust. There is less trust. More people at the top are stealing more money. I mean, people steal money in every country. That happens everywhere. But the degree that it happens is much greater in poorer countries. And certainly part of that. So part of the issue is, well, what if a country is corrupt? What impact does that have on economic development? Well, if the government or if some organization is stealing from you, for example, in Italy, in southern Italy, you have the problem of organized crime. So the corruption in a country like that is organized crime. If you try to do business in southern Italy, the organized criminals are going to knock on your door. That will happen. If you try to do any transaction, you have to pay. It's like a third world country, southern Italy is. So I know that. I can tell you a lot of stories about personal knowledge about corruption in Sicily, because my family has to experience in Sicily. So I'm familiar. So I can see, and I can see there's definitely an impact. But then you look at China. China's on, I didn't put this deliberately, this is just a sample, but I wanted to show you the type of data I use. But look at China. and you'll see it's in the 30s. It's relatively very, by the standards of Transparency International, fairly corrupt country. It's almost as corrupt as a lot of or more corrupt as African countries. And yet we all know that China's grown tremendously. It's had a tremendous economic growth. So they've been able to do it. So we're really due, and I think it is the great example that when we, especially in the West, try to tell ourselves that, well, you need freedom and you need all of these things in order to have economic development. Well, China's, to some degree, that challenges that. Now, you know, when you meet Chinese people, I have them in my class, that there is a desire to get away, at least away from Beijing if you're in China, and if you're not in China, you know, there's certainly, they feel more, you feel that they feel more free to do things. They certainly are more free to do things. But they do a lot of things in China too. A lot of things are happening, positive things are happening in China. So that's a very interesting question. We're going to talk about another country, an example in Africa, Rwanda. You know, certainly there's a lower level of corruption, but a very powerful, what's the word I'm looking for? A bit oppressive government, and yet you're having economic growth. So these things can happen. These things can happen, and it's a very interesting question. But we're going to look at this. We're going to look at the level of corruption and see to what degree you can compare the level of corruption. I just wanted to, I did a smoothing there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show the score. What I did was I smoothed it because there's a lot of volatility. As a statistician, I'm concerned about the volatility in the Transparency International data. I think to some degree it's a bit, and because there's a bit of what we call subjective, it's a bit subjective. It's people's perception. It's a perception of corruption. You know how much corruption. Well, people think it's corrupt. So does that really mean it's corrupt? You know, it depends. And how do you compare that with another country? It may not be as corrupt, but maybe people complain about it more. My country, for example, people like to complain, and they're complaining very loudly. And you would think that the country's falling apart if you read the American press. Well, it's not happening. The economy's growing very nicely. Thank you. You're having a lot of economic growth, but Washington is people's minds are blowing up in Washington. So that's the very, and in the media. So you want to keep that in mind. And with that, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about that, keep that in mind with when you see these numbers. I'm going to compare that to show you the change. This does show the changes that have taken place, at least the perception of the change. And then I'm going to look at the growth rate, GDP growth rate. So I think this will be very useful. This is the kind of thing that I did that I think will be very useful, Hanako, for your particular work. You'll want to take a good look at this data and try to understand what I've done here. In other words, I think this is a very useful approach because we say, well, as economists, we say, well, this is really nice. I mean, you've got these nice numbers, but we're data driven. We got to see numbers. We got to see real numbers. This is perception. This is reality. You know, so that's what we're going to do here. So here's the perception. Perception is here's the 50 mark right in the middle. That's where you get white. So you've got like Namibia, just right around 50. You met Brunei. Brunei would be about here. So Brunei would be maybe about like Botswana. So, but in comparison, Brunei would be the least corrupt. If Brunei was in Africa, it was the least corrupt, one of the least corrupt countries in Africa. Just as comparison. Angola, that is an astonishingly corrupt country. That's one of the most expensive countries in the world to live in. believe it or not. Luanda is one of the world's most expensive countries for expats. And there is a large expat community in Luanda because of the oil industry. And it is the most expensive cost of living. Probably one of the most expensive cities in the world is Luanda, Angola. Because and this is a country that actually, it has enough, it could feed Africa. It's rich enough in agricultural capacity to feed Africa. But it can't even feed its own people. And it's as I say, it's so corrupt that the expats, and they probably, everybody's living in these, just right in the city and the whole and a lot of, because there's going to be a lot of crime and all of that. So that's one of the most corrupt countries in the world. Here's Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe is an interesting example because you just the last couple of weeks, Robert Mugabe, who's been in power since 1980, and I remember when he came to power in 1980, and everybody thought that things were going to be wonderful. Things were going to work out. Everybody figured it's going to work out. And unfortunately, it did work out very well for Mugabe and his supporters, his immediate supporters, and his new wife did very well. She made a lot of money too. But a lot of people, they basically, and I can understand, they kicked the white farmers off the land. They expropriated the land, turned it over. The white farmers had all the best farmland. They had taken it from the natives in the late 19th century. The natives, 100 years later, got back. The problem is it didn't work out very well, and the country's in quite a mess. I don't know what the right thing. Would the right thing to be to have people that had colonialists in power, people a little bit better off, but they have a tight control, or to have self-rule and this kind of misrule. So it's an interesting question. Somalia is another, is probably considered the corruptest country in the world. Somalia, mainly because there's very little government. Somalia has almost no government, but they actually have people with a lot of money, believe it or not, in Somalia. And one of the fascinating things about Somalia is that the number of flights, international flights, has increased dramatically since the country fell apart. When the country had a functioning government, there were almost no flights there. Now there are a lot of flights that go. After the country fell apart, the roads actually got maintained better. With no government, people they self-organized and maintained the roads better than when they had a government. So I don't, it's a very funny, a curious situation. Then you have Sudan, very low. Libya, very, very low. The Central Africa right here. That's Burundi. Burundi, very repressive government as well. Very repressive government. There's Rwanda. There's Rwanda right there. That is a very low level. It's considered a very low level of corruption. 20 years ago, 25 years ago, more than 1 million people died in that country. There was ethnic violence, and a significant percentage of the population. That million represented a significant, I think 20% of the population was killed in a absolute slaughter of one ethnic group killing another. It was quite a horrific event. You now have a president, Paul Kagame, and Kagame is fairly authoritarian, but it's fairly free economy. And he welcomes economic development. It's a fairly transparent country. It's considered transparent, low corruption. It's a little bit oppressive. Kagame wants to stay in power. He doesn't want to. He likes being president, but he seems to be doing, by African standards, he's doing a very good job. So here's an example. You had a Mugabe who destroyed his country, and you have a Kagame who is able to build his country up. And the interesting thing, as I say, after the terror that happened 25 years ago, it's amazing that country's not only been able to build, but it's one of the most prosperous countries in that part of the world. Very prosperous country now. So it's a fascinating story. So if you're this is one of the stories that if you're interested in this, you want to take a look and see, well, what's going on in Rwanda. Yeah, Rwanda, fascinating. No, it would be very interesting to go there. I would be very interested to go there and find out. There's a lot of there's a lot of expats that are there that are it's quite. There's a lot of international business in the Kigali is the capital that live in Kigali. As you say, it's a small country. It's very small. You've got all this. This is Eastern Congo. Lots of problems. Very weak government. This is incredibly weak government. But here you've got. It's quite reasonably well managed. You'll see some of the other countries. Djibouti. That's Djibouti. Ethiopia. A little bit less corruption. Senegal. You did the piece on Senegal. This is it. You can see how in Senegal is a bright story. It's a bright story in Africa. Relatively low corruption. They have relatively free elections, and it surrounds a country that's kind of a basket case. The Gambia. That little thread. That is the country of the Gambia. That just last December, the old dictator who'd been there for more than 30 years was thrown out. So what's interesting to see, and I haven't heard anything since that happened, but that sounds like that could be a renewal in that country. And then here's Ghana. Now I've personally been to Ghana, and I've studied it as part. I was working on, and this is another long story, but I was working on with somebody who wanted to develop an office building in the capital of Accra, and so I was able to go there. It's really a very interesting country. It is a country where there's a reasonable rule of law. There's a lot of silly stuff that it could be better run, but they have functioning. The infrastructure functions, the government functions. You can see it feels like a developing urban area. It certainly doesn't feel like a Western country, but it feels reasonably normal. I walked around. I wasn't worried about. People were friendly. I've talked to people. Other parts of Africa where they experienced a lot of hostility, but I was able to walk around Accra and not with no fear at all. I thought very comfortable. I would definitely go back there, and I'd love to go to Kigali and see what's going on there. I would go to a place like Lagos in Nigeria just to, because I've worked with the Nigerians, just to see, kind of connect to see what's going on in that country, and of course Senegal would be fascinating, just because of that. Here's Liberia. Liberia a little bit less. That of course has Liberia has a lot of strong ties with the United States. The people that run Liberia are descendants of American slaves that went back to Africa in the 1860s, and so they went back there and basically they became the ruling. At least my understanding is they became essentially the ruling class of that country. Then we want to look and see, now we can see where the changes, and this was in that 2000-2015 period, where did we see changes take place? We want to see what the trend is, what our country is becoming more or less. And so the point here is that Africa is moving in a positive direction. And I think that's the point that I want to make, that in general you are seeing a lot of positive and some very, very, you see Senegal, Liberia, that's Sierra Leone. They had a lot of ethnic strife in Sierra Leone and Liberia. That got past that. Not so much in Cote d'Ivoire. Cote d'Ivoire less, but you see even Nigeria, Togo, Benin, Ghana, Burkina Faso, Niger, and even Algeria, quite positive things happening. Well, there's Rwanda, of course, one of the brightest spots in the world in terms reduction in corruption. Zambia, of course, China's made a lot of investments in Eastern Africa in general. And certainly China is playing a big role in the development of Africa, and I think it's very likely is having a positive impact. So this is an example of that. Madagascar, that's Madagascar there. There's Lesotho, the little country that's surrounded by South Africa, Lesotho, and Swaziland. That's so Swaziland again, and I don't really know what's going on in Swaziland. I can't. These are two countries I just know. I don't have any knowledge. And there's Djibouti, of course. Has anybody ever heard of Djibouti? Djibouti I remember meeting somebody from Djibouti once. Very nice fellow. He had been living. He was living in Dubai. He went to Dubai, but he talked about his country. And it's a small country that is right. If you look right here, it's right on the entrance of the Red Sea. So it's actually strategic importance. It's a very strategically important location. It's one of the possibly the hottest places, one of the hottest places in the world in terms of average annual temperature. So it's a terrible. The climate's probably one of the worst climates in the world for humans to live in. But people live there, and it's about the size of Burundi and about the same population, about 400,000, roughly 400,000. There's naval bases. The French have a naval base there. The Americans have a naval base there. It's to protect the shipping, that goes through the Suez Canal. And there's one other country that now has just very recently set up a naval base there, and that's China. So China now is a naval base. And one of the things that I've told, as I lectured on this last year, I actually found this to be a very positive development. Because one of the Chinese and American navies, the military, some of the closest interaction that Chinese and Americans, military people are going to have in the world is in Djibouti. So it's actually quite an important, and their being there is probably, that means there's going to be a lot of close communication. They're going to get to know each other, and there's going to be close communication there. Certainly they're going to be spying on each other, but it's also going to be, there's also some positives that can come out of it. So it's certainly an interesting, it's an interesting situation, as you say. It's had a great improvement. On the other hand, you got Eritrea. Eritrea is a curious place because it's an incredibly repressive country. They fought for 30 years, 40 years to be free of the Ethiopians. The civil war, very terrible civil war lasted like 30, 40 years. Tremendous casualties. At great price, they became free. And when they became free, they established a repressive government. You know, they're poor and they're governed much more brutally than the Ethiopians did. I don't know. I don't get it. But and if you go, for example, if you're in maybe even here, but certainly in the U.S., if you go to an Ethiopian restaurant in New York, they're actually Eritreans. Most of the people there are actually that have Ethiopian restaurants are actually Eritrean. So that's kind of interesting because they're poor. There's poor people. They fled. They fled their country, and that's it. It's it's a very corrupt place. That's very corrupt. Tunisia is kind of an interesting example. Interesting. It's gone the wrong way. Tunisia. If you've never met Tunisians, if you meet them, you would hardly. Many of them you would think they're European. And I've met Tunisians, and I didn't know they were Tunisian until they said they were Tunisian. So you could have some. I thought they were European, and so it's and it's right there next to Europe. You can actually see it from Sicily on a clear day. You can see the coast of Africa from there. But that's so it's real close to Europe, but it's slid back. Now we look at the GDP growth rate, and this is what we want to see. This is what you want to see is say, okay, let's compare. Here's the direction. Here's the amount of corruption. Here's the direction. What's the impact on GDP? And I think you'd have to say there is some there's some relationship. This is where this direction. Look at Nigeria. Look at Ghana. Look at Niger. Look at Chad. Look at Sierra Leone. Then the East African Zambia. But there's some differences. The two countries around South Africa haven't. Certainly not Swaziland. You know, it's a bit, and then you have Sudan has shown positive growth. It's a little bit of a mixed picture. It's a mixed picture, but the trend seems to be, and then in West Africa you'll see you've had negative growth and yet positive direction. So, and Senegal has had not much growth, but positive direction. So, you know, it's hard to tell. It almost gets down to individual countries, individual stories. Now we're going to go to Europe, and you can see the corruption index. And I remember I talked about Italy, and look at Italy and Greece. Italy really is below 50. Italy is, and I assure you, that's real. I assure you, I can personally assure you some of what life is like. I know a little bit what life is like in Sicily, having been there a few times and having family there and hearing and seeing what goes on there. That's a very different. That's a very, very different situation. Italy is a much more corrupt country than you compare that with the northern European countries, or even like Switzerland, right there, Switzerland. Now northern Italy is more Europe. It's like northern Europe, but southern Italy is almost like Africa in terms of that. So you'll see these and the Baltic states. But you have to remember, this was part of the Ottoman Empire. So the story, this was Turkey, which was the center of the Ottoman Empire. That's kind of a culture. You know, all of these countries, including Greece, the Greeks would hate to say that, admit that, but they were part of the Ottoman Empire. But you'll see this. You'll see that this is probably a legacy of that, of the impact of that. And it's a different culture. You know, it was a different culture, it was a different political culture, different social culture. Some of these are Muslim countries, Islamic countries. Albania is Islamic. That's Kosovo. We don't have it here, not data, but that's Muslim. That's Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is a mix. And of course, Bulgaria. Of course, there's Turkey. Bulgaria, I think it's Orthodox. Bulgaria is. I think there's some. I think there's some Muslims, but not. I think it's more Orthodox. Of course, Romania is an Orthodox country, but all of these were, all of this part of the world was once controlled by the Ottomans. And if you want to see how much the conflict between those two countries are quite. I was in Istanbul once, and there was a World Championship basketball game, and the Greece and Turkey were playing, and the people were watching it like it was war. You know, the Turks were sitting there, and it was like so intense. You know, it was like nothing more, and they wanted to win. You know, you could just see this kind of, centuries of this, this kind of thing. So, at any rate, that is you can see. Then you got the Russian. Then you got Russia. All of that. Russia is a whole different, as we say, a different kettle of fish. The impact of Russia and Ukraine. The fascinating thing about Ukraine is that, and I was reading this morning about some corruption nonsense in the Ukraine. It's just ridiculous. And the thing is, you would think these people, they'd spent 400 years trying to break free of the Russians. And now they spend all their energy on just destroying each other. I don't get it. And there's Belarus, which is considered to be the last dictatorship in Europe. Lukashenko. That's of course part of Russia. That's why that's red. That is part of Russia. These are the Baltic states. And the Baltic states are different. Poland, more European. That's Hungary, that's I'm sorry, that's Czech Republic and Slovakia. So that's kind of in the middle. Hungary a little bit above normal, I'm sorry, above 50. That's right around 50. There's Slovakia. There's Slovenia. There, these were the more this was the most prosperous country in the former Yugoslavia. This Croatia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Montenegro, Serbia. This was all part of Kosovo, Macedonia. This was all part of the former Yugoslavia. All of those countries. But you can see this was the one that was the most European of Northern Europe. This was the closest connected to Northern Europe, closely connected to Italy. There. But Estonia is actually, they're Finnish. It's a Finnish language. They're ethnically related to the Finns. They're very close, of course, very close ties there. So that's not surprising. Of course, the Northern Europeans, very high. These are considered to be some of the most open and least corrupt countries in the world. You know, that's of course they're based in London, so the people there think very highly of themselves. So, which people usually, most people do think highly of themselves. So that's part of, you have to remember, this is based in London, so it's Londoners who think that you keep that in mind as to where this comes from. But of course, everybody loves the Danes. This is Denmark. Everybody loves them. They never cause anybody any problems. So when you don't cause anybody problems, everyone loves you. You know, so here's the change, and the interesting thing is you can see, well, they don't like they're clearly unhappy with what happened in their own country. I'm not quite sure why. I think probably because of UKIP, and this is part of it, is that part of this is that in the rise of UKIP and the reaction to the flood of immigrants, people they got this negative reaction. But you can see Italy was thought to go very much the wrong direction. But again, I think that was because of a certain Prime Minister, Berlusconi. I don't know if you've heard of him, but they clearly didn't like him. Spain is an interesting one, and you want to do Spain, and Spain's just been going through. I think it's an interesting choice. You're making an interesting choice. Ikushima-san's going to do his work on Spain, and the thing here is that Spain's been through a lot. It's been through a lot of bad. It had a real boom. It was a real artifice. It was an explosion. I sent you a couple of papers on that, and I think that at least one of them I think gives a very good background to the housing crisis there, and it's kind of part of the whole problem. And very high unemployment, very high youth unemployment. The country's not organized very well for young people. It's kind of a country in some ways like Italy, that it's really not a single country. It's really a lot of different regions that are controlled by Madrid, and Madrid right in the center, which kind of, and it's resented, and Madrid is disliked by the Spaniards. And here's Catalonia, you were mentioning. Catalonia, of course, has made efforts to. There's a lot of people there that want to be independent. There's a lot of conflict about that. Barcelona is actually very prosperous region, but they consider that's gone in the wrong direction. That's Iceland. I'm not quite sure. Iceland. Some of this stuff is. I think Iceland's done pretty. I would really debate that. That change for Iceland doesn't. I don't think that's is realistic. This is showing the former Yugoslavia, Albania, the former Yugoslavia, very positive. A lot of positive changes throughout the region. Romania. Romania is quite, this is in Turkey's interesting. I wonder what they would say now. Turkey certainly is, the Prime Minister, it's an interesting thing that's happened. The army in Turkey was, and here's where, this is an interesting question, and I think in terms of Hanako, your question about what's the impact of, that trade-off, corruption and repression and political and economic. I've traveled a bit in Turkey. I really like the country. I traveled around it. I got on a bus and traveled around in the interior. I'd love to go back. It's a fascinating, absolutely fascinating country. I just couldn't. I mean, Istanbul is a wonderful. I love Istanbul, but to I get on a bus and just start traveling around the country. It's really an interesting place. But the what was I going to say about that? Turkey has been a country that the army was the source of its it had a secular stamp. Ataturk, when after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, Kemal Ataturk became the leader of the country. He took it in. He wanted to make it a modern country. As part of it, Greece wanted to take back Constantinople. They were able to. The Turks were able to keep Constantinople after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, and he basically rebuilt it. And it was rebuilt as a secular country, but secular that was based on the army and a certain degree of repression by the army. So you had this kind of political, social freedom that was based on a degree of repression. So now you're getting more political freedom. You're getting more political freedom, but now that's coming at the cost, the army has been removed as the source, the center of power now. But there's also a very fundamentalist aspect to it. I remember being in the city right here called Konya, and Konya and Erdogan came to the Prime Minister. Erdogan came to speak, and I remember the fascinating thing that I saw. I didn't stay for the speech, but I noticed how you could see a very clear difference between the fundamentalists and the way they dress, the Turkish fundamentalists, and then about half the population looked just secular. Half the population secular, half kind of religious. And at the Erdogan speech, I could see all the people come. They were all religious. You could tell they were all religious people. The way that they dressed, every one of them religious people. I went to another part of the city. I walked into a mall, and I could have been in California. Teenage girls were running around in shorts. It was a hot summer day. They're running. I felt like I could have been in America. Any place in America. It looked. It was, and all of those people were there. So what you've had is a situation, and it was just like so visually, and I could see the big difference in income. The secular people, higher income. Religious, lower income. But there's more of them. They've taken the power of the government and driven the army out, and so the government's getting more repressive, but for them they feel like it's more free because they're more religiously free. So how do you define that? I don't know. How do you define? Because those people, that's the majority of the people. It's a democratic society. They do vote Democratic, and they voted democratically for this. So, but if you're a secular person, you feel more oppressed. You certainly feel more oppressed. But if you're a religious person, you feel more free. So how do you define that? And that's and as I say, when you think about this kind, I think it's a fascinating thing to study. It's a fascinating thing to study. You've got to keep in mind, and part of it is to keep an open mind, which is not easy because we all have biases. But to keep an open mind to say, well, try to look, what's the perspective of each of these people? So as I say, I remember that experience very well because I really could see, the difference. And the secularists, you could see a lot of conflict between the groups. Any rate, we're out of time now. We're going to continue this topic next time. And we'll just continue that. I look forward to I'll get back to the feedback on that. And Riki, you've got your, as I say, for you, definitely, Catalonia is a fascinating topic. I think it's a great topic, but I think it's too big. I think it's just another, I would look at that, I would save that for another paper. It's just too big of, that's like another thing. I think that the core topic about talking about the run-up to the boom and the aftermath and what's going on in that country, and with at least some focus on the real estate market, or some looking at the real estate market and the economy. I think that's a topic. That's a full topic. Catalonia is another.
Yeah.
But I think it's a great topic. I would save that for, like, if you're interested in Spain, to do that next. That would be the next thing, because there is a connection there.
Yeah.
It's a connection, but it's kind of like a part of the story rather than the whole story. So, okay.